San Francisco, 1955. On a quiet street overlooking the city, there was an apartment that looked completely ordinary. A bedroom, a living room, a kitchen. Nothing about it suggested that it was connected to one of the most controversial intelligence programs of the Cold War. But hidden inside that apartment were microphones, and somewhere nearby, people were watching. The people entering the apartment didn't know they were being observed. They didn't know they were part of an intelligence experiment, and some didn't know that the drugs they were given had been placed there deliberately. The CIA wanted to know what would happen when human behavior was altered without the person's knowledge. Could drugs make someone more vulnerable? Could they change judgment? Could they make interrogation easier? Could an ordinary person be manipulated simply by changing their mental state? These were not questions being asked in a university psychology laboratory. They were being investigated by the American intelligence community during the Cold War. And one of the places where those experiments took place was a secret apartment in San Francisco. The operation would later become known as Operation Midnight Climax. But Midnight Climax was only one piece of something much larger, because behind that apartment was a CIA program that had become obsessed with a terrifying possibility. What if the human mind could be controlled? To understand why the CIA created these experiments, we have to go back to the beginning of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing for military power, technological superiority, and intelligence. But the competition wasn't limited to weapons. American intelligence officials were also worried about interrogation. There were reports of prisoners being subjected to psychological pressure, drugs and other techniques by communist governments. Whether every report was accurate was another question, but inside the CIA, the fear was real. American intelligence officials wanted to know whether a chemical substance could change a person's behavior. Could someone be made to reveal information? Could memory be disrupted? Could resistance be weakened? Could a person's perception of reality be altered? And most importantly, could any of these effects be controlled? The problem was that the human brain wasn't a machine. Give two people the same substance, and they might react differently. One might become confused, another might become frightened, another might become euphoric, and another might simply become unpredictable. That unpredictability was exactly what made psychedelic drugs so interesting and so dangerous to intelligence researchers. Among the substances attracting attention was LSD. The drug had powerful effects on perception, mood, and cognition. To intelligence officials searching for a chemical shortcut to human behavior, it appeared to offer a possibility. But there was only one way to learn more: experiment. And eventually, the experiments moved beyond laboratories. They moved into ordinary American life. The answer would eventually involve something that sounded more like a crime story than a scientific program: safehouses. In 1955, the CIA established a safe house in San Francisco. It was located on Telegraph Hill. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary apartment. Inside, however, the environment had been designed for observation. Microphones were installed. The CIA wanted to observe people in a natural social setting. That meant the subjects couldn't know they were part of an experiment. If they knew, their behavior might change. And that would ruin the experiment, so the setting had to feel real. The people had to believe they were simply living through an ordinary social encounter. The safe house eventually became associated with a brothel operation. Women working there interacted with men who entered the apartment. The men who walked through the door had no reason to believe anything unusual was happening. They thought they were entering a private apartment. They didn't know that microphones were recording what they said. They didn't know that people in another room were watching their behavior. And they certainly didn't know that some of the encounters were connected to a CIA experiment. The observers weren't looking for a single dramatic reaction. They wanted to know how people behaved under altered mental conditions. Did they become more talkative? Did they become confused? Did they reveal information they normally wouldn't reveal? Did their personalities change? The CIA wasn't simply interested in whether someone would hallucinate. The larger question was whether a person's behavior could be influenced. If a drug could disrupt judgment, memory, or perception, what could that mean during an interrogation? What could it mean during an intelligence operation? One of the substances that attracted the CIA's attention was LSD. Its effects could be powerful. Perception could change. Time could seem distorted. A person's emotional state could shift dramatically. But there was another problem: the effects were unpredictable. One person might become relaxed, another might become frightened, someone else might become confused, and another person might react in a completely different way. For researchers hoping to develop a reliable technique, that presented a serious problem. The human mind didn't behave like a machine. That's one reason the safe house was important. Researchers could observe people outside the artificial environment of a laboratory. The subjects could talk, they could interact, they could behave naturally, or at least they could behave naturally as long as they didn't know they were being watched. But this created an ethical problem that was impossible to ignore. The people being observed had not volunteered for the experiment. They had not agreed to participate. They had not been told what was being studied, and they had no opportunity to give informed consent. Somewhere else in the building, researchers were taking notes. They were recording conversations. They were watching reactions. They were trying to turn unpredictable human behavior into usable intelligence. And the people being studied had no idea any of this was happening. But Midnight Climax wasn't an isolated experiment. It existed inside a much larger CIA program. That program was known as MKULTRA. And MKULTRA would eventually involve researchers, universities, hospitals, prisons, and other institutions across the United States and beyond. The program required money. It required researchers. It required safe locations. And it required a system that could keep the CIA's involvement hidden. In some cases, money could move through intermediary organizations, making the ultimate source of funding difficult to see. This made the program difficult to understand from the outside. One researcher might know only about his experiment. Another might know only where the money came from. Someone else might know that the CIA was involved. And the people being experimented on might know nothing at all. But secrecy could not protect the program forever. By the early 1960s, questions were beginning to emerge inside the CIA itself. Investigators started examining some of the program's activities, and one issue was particularly disturbing: the use of unwitting human subjects. The CIA's Inspector General reviewed parts of the program. The review raised serious concerns about the use of drugs on people who didn't know they were being experimented on. But even an internal investigation could not immediately undo what had already happened. The experiments had taken place. The records existed. And then, years later, something happened that would make the story much harder to reconstruct. Many of the MKULTRA records were destroyed. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of much of the program's surviving operational documentation. The result was devastating for historians. Names disappeared, dates disappeared, details disappeared. Some experiments would never be reconstructed completely, and for a while, it seemed possible that much of the story would disappear with the records. For several years, the public knew very little. Then, unexpectedly, some records survived. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request helped lead investigators to a collection of financial records connected to MKULTRA. They weren't the complete operational files, but they were enough to show just how extensive the program had been. And there they were, 7 boxes, financial records that had somehow escaped the destruction. 7 boxes that would give investigators a glimpse into a program the CIA had tried to erase from its own history. The records revealed payments, they revealed researchers, they revealed institutions, they revealed how money had moved through the program. They didn't answer every question, but they proved something important. MKULTRA wasn't a rumor. The discovery helped reignite congressional interest. By 1977, the question was no longer simply what the CIA had done. It was whether the agency had violated the rights of American citizens. Congress wanted answers. On August 3, 1977, the Senate held hearings examining MKULTRA. Government officials were questioned about the program, the surviving records were examined, and the use of unwitting human subjects became one of the central concerns. The hearings forced a question into the open: what happens when an intelligence agency decides that national security justifies experimenting on people who don't know they're being experimented on? The issue wasn't simply whether LSD worked, it was whether the government had the right to secretly give it to someone who never agreed to take it. For ordinary Americans, the revelations were difficult to comprehend. The CIA was supposed to protect the country, yet now Americans were hearing testimony about secret experiments involving drugs and unwitting people. The hidden world of Cold War intelligence was suddenly appearing on television. But there was still a major problem. Much of the evidence was gone. The operational records had been destroyed. The surviving financial records could show where money went. They could reveal the existence and scale of the program, but they could not tell investigators everything that had happened inside every experiment. That's why the story of Midnight Climax has to be handled carefully. There are things we know. There are things the surviving records strongly support. And there are things we simply cannot know because the evidence was destroyed. The gaps matter. And then there was another story that became connected to the broader MKULTRA investigation: Frank Olson. Olson was a CIA-linked scientist who, in 1953, was unknowingly given LSD during a gathering of intelligence personnel. Days later, he died, after falling from a hotel window. Olson's death has generated decades of controversy and investigation, but it is important not to confuse his case with Operation Midnight Climax itself. His story belongs to the larger MKULTRA history. It demonstrates just how wide-ranging the program had become, and how difficult its full history would be to reconstruct. The distinction matters. Midnight Climax was a specific CIA operation involving safehouses, surveillance, and unwitting subjects. MKUltra was the much larger umbrella program. Frank Olson's story belongs to that wider history. Keeping those distinctions clear is important because the surviving evidence is already incomplete. So did the CIA actually develop mind control? The evidence doesn't support the idea that the agency discovered a reliable formula for controlling another person's mind. What the experiments demonstrate is something much less cinematic, and arguably more disturbing. They demonstrate how far researchers were willing to go looking for one. A drug can alter perception, it can disrupt memory, it can change mood, it can make someone more confused or vulnerable, but alteration isn't the same thing as control. The human mind remained unpredictable. The most disturbing part of Midnight Climax isn't that the CIA discovered a magical mind control formula. They didn't. The disturbing part is that the agency was willing to find out by experimenting on people who didn't know they were participating. The people entering the safe house didn't know. They couldn't consent. They couldn't refuse. And they couldn't tell researchers afterward exactly what had happened to them, because they didn't even know there had been an experiment. That was the central trick of the safe house. The experiment had to remain invisible. The room had to look ordinary. The conversation had to feel ordinary. The people had to believe they were simply living their lives. Meanwhile, someone else was studying them. Somewhere outside the room, someone was watching. They were listening to conversations that had never been offered to them. They were observing reactions that had never been volunteered. And they were recording behavior that the people involved believed was private. And the safe house itself was only one part of the machinery. Behind it were administrators, researchers, funding arrangements, intelligence officers, and a chain of secrecy designed to keep the program compartmentalized. What began as an attempt to understand human behavior had grown into something much larger. The CIA was testing drugs, it was studying psychology, it was exploring interrogation techniques, and in some cases, people were being used without knowing they were part of the experiment. Eventually, even inside the CIA, concerns were raised. Internal investigators examined parts of the program, they questioned the use of unwitting subjects, they questioned how the experiments were being conducted, but the existence of concern did not erase what had already happened. Years later, much of the documentation would be destroyed. That decision created a permanent hole in the historical record. We know MKUltra existed. We know experiments involving unwitting people took place. We know Operation Midnight Climax existed, but we don't know everything that happened. And yet, some evidence survived. 7 boxes, financial records, congressional testimony, declassified documents. Enough pieces remain to reconstruct part of the story. And this is where the story needs to separate fact from speculation. We can document the existence of MKUltra. We can document the CIA's interest in LSD and behavioral research. We can document the use of unwitting subjects. We can document the San Francisco safe house operation. But we shouldn't turn missing evidence into invented certainty. What happened to every person who entered those rooms? How many people were affected? What other experiments were never fully documented? And how much more could we know today if the records had survived? Now go back to San Francisco, back to that apartment on Telegraph Hill. Imagine walking through the front door. The room looks ordinary, the furniture is ordinary, the conversation sounds ordinary. But now you know something the people inside didn't. There are microphones, someone is listening, someone is taking notes, and the people in the room are not simply guests, they are subjects. The microphone doesn't care whether the conversation is important. It records everything, a joke, a confession, a private conversation, a moment of confusion. None of it was volunteered for scientific research. Decades later, the people are gone, the observers are gone, the microphones are gone, much of the documentation is gone. What remains is a collection of records, testimony and fragments, enough to know that it happened, not enough to answer everything. Operation Midnight Climax was never the story of a perfect mind control machine. It was the story of what happened when the search for control collided with human freedom. It was a story about secrecy, about power, about people who didn't know they were part of an experiment, and about records that were destroyed before history could ask every question. Some secrets were never meant to survive, and some did.